a Bentley. Where are you coming from with a car like that?
Good evening, officer. I'm coming from work. Is there a problem?
Work? What kind of work pays for a Bentley? You dealing something you shouldn't be?
No, sir. I'm an attorney. I work at the federal courthouse.
Attorney? Sure. And I'm supposed to...
In the underground parking garage of an upscale shopping center in downtown Atlanta, a police officer confronted a black man standing beside an expensive vehicle, immediately assuming the car couldn't possibly belong to him. What started as a simple trip to pick up a birthday gift would escalate into a documented case of racial profiling that would cost the city over $14 million and force an entire precinct to reckon with its practices. Before we continue, I need you to do something. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And please, hit that subscribe button right now. This story gets absolutely wild, and you're going to want to see how it ends. Officer Derek Paulson, 39 years old, had spent 11 years with the Atlanta Police Department, most of them working the affluent Buckhead district. His personnel file showed a troubling trend that supervisors had consistently overlooked. In the past 3 years alone, he'd initiated 216 vehicle stops in parking garages and lots throughout his patrol area. 178 of those stops involved Black or Hispanic drivers. 134 involved vehicles valued over $75,000. And of those 134 stops, only 9 resulted in any citation or arrest. A success rate so low, it suggested the stops had nothing to do with law enforcement. But the complaints against Paulson never seemed to stick. Victims would file reports describing aggressive questioning, demands to explain how they could afford their vehicles, threats of arrest for refusing unlawful searches. The department would investigate. Paulson would claim he was just being thorough, and the complaints would be marked as unsubstantiated. The pattern continued, unchecked, until the evening he stopped the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time. The parking garage beneath Lenox Square was a concrete maze of luxury vehicles, designer shopping bags, and the quiet hum of engines echoing off low ceilings. Security cameras covered every angle, high-definition feeds recording 24 hours a day, backed up to secure servers that kept footage for 90 days. Every entrance, every parking space, every elevator had eyes on it. The garage was designed to be safe, to protect expensive cars and expensive purchases from theft. No one had considered it might need to protect people from being profiled by police. Judge William Carter, 46 years old, was standing beside his Bentley Continental, loading shopping bags into the trunk after purchasing a watch for his daughter's 16th birthday. He was a federal appellate court judge, one of only 12 in the 11th Circuit, with a reputation for meticulous legal analysis and absolutely zero tolerance for constitutional violations. He'd spent the day reviewing briefs in a complex civil rights case. Now he just wanted to get home, wrap the gift, and surprise his daughter at dinner. He was arranging the bags carefully in the trunk, making sure the jewelry box wouldn't shift during the drive when he noticed the patrol car in his peripheral vision, not passing through, not patrolling, but stopped, angled slightly, positioned behind the Bentley. The officer inside was staring directly at him. Judge Carter's first thought was practical. Maybe there'd been an incident in the garage, a theft report, a suspicious person call. He continued organizing his bags, hands visible, expecting the officer to either move along or approach with a legitimate question. What he didn't expect was what happened next. Officer Paulson stepped out of his patrol car with the confidence of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. He walked directly toward Carter, his footsteps echoing in the concrete space, each step deliberate and heavy, not the cautious approach of an officer concerned about threats, assessing danger, maintaining tactical awareness. This was the casual swagger of someone who'd already decided this stop was justified, who'd made assumptions before a single word was exchanged, who'd profiled a person based on nothing more than the color of their skin and the value of their vehicle. He approached from the side, positioning himself between Carter and the open trunk. His presence was deliberately intimidating, close enough to invade personal space, aggressive enough that shoppers nearby noticed the tension immediately. "Good evening, officer. Is everything all right?" Carter asked, his tone polite but direct, keeping his hands visible near the shopping bags. Paulson's eyes scanned Carter from head to toe, then moved to the shopping bags in the trunk, then to the Bentley itself, the leather interior visible through the open door, the shopping bag from an upscale jeweler, the pristine condition of the vehicle. Everything about the scene screamed wealth, and everything about the man standing beside it, in Paulson's view, didn't match. License and registration. Now, the tone wasn't a request, it was a command, delivered without explanation, without courtesy, without any acknowledgement that the person before him might be there legitimately, might have every right to load shopping bags into his own car without being interrogated. might deserve the same presumption of lawfulness that white drivers in expensive vehicles received without question. May I ask why you're stopping me? Judge Carter kept his voice even, professional. I'm loading my vehicle. I haven't violated any laws. I'll tell you why in a minute. License and registration. Paulson's hand moved to his belt, resting near his weapon, a gesture designed to remind Carter exactly who held power in this encounter. Judge Carter slowly reached for his wallet in his back pocket, movements deliberate and visible. Officer, I'm cooperating fully, but I'd like to know the reason for this stop. Paulson barely glanced at the license when Carter handed it to him. Where's the registration? It's in the glove box. I can retrieve it. Do that. And keep your hands where I can see them. Carter opened the driver's door, leaned in to access the glove box, and retrieved the registration. He handed it to Paulson along with his license, all movements slow and visible. Paulson barely glanced at the documents. Instead, he began walking around the Bentley, circling it slowly, running his hand along the paint, checking the rims, peering through the windows. His body camera recorded everything, the sleek lines of the expensive car, the judge standing calmly beside it, shopping bags visible in the trunk, and most importantly, the officer's own actions that would later be picked apart frame by frame in federal court. This is a Bentley Continental GT, Paulson said, returning to where Carter stood. Goes for about $250,000 new. You want to tell me how you can afford that? Judge Carter's expression didn't change. But internally, he recognized exactly what was happening. He'd presided over cases like this. He'd read depositions describing these exact questions. He knew the playbook. I'm not required to explain my finances to you, officer. I've provided my license and registration. If there's a violation you're investigating, please tell me what it is. The violation, Paulson said, stepping closer, is that you look like someone who shouldn't be driving this car. So either you're gonna explain where you got it, or I'm gonna assume it's stolen. The words hung in the air, clear, documented, undeniable. The security cameras overhead captured the moment, multiple angles showing the officer's aggressive posture, the judge standing calmly beside his vehicle with shopping bags in the open trunk, and the confrontation building in a parking garage that should have been nothing more than a place to load purchases and leave. A woman walking to her car slowed down, sensing tension in the way people do when something feels wrong, even if they can't immediately articulate why. The body language, the aggressive posture, the way the officer positioned himself to intimidate. She pulled out her phone, not to make a call, but to record, understanding instinctively that documentation might matter, that whatever was unfolding might need witnesses, that silence was complicity. An elderly man loading shopping bags into his trunk stopped mid-motion, bags dangling from his hands, watching the confrontation develop. He'd lived through the civil rights movement. He'd seen this before. Different uniforms, different vehicles, but the same fundamental dynamic of power being misused, of bias being enforced, of someone being made to justify their existence in a space they had every right to occupy. More shoppers emerged from the elevator, drawn by the commotion, the raised voices, the unmistakable tension of a police encounter that had gone wrong. They formed a loose semicircle, maintaining distance but refusing to leave, their presence creating a buffer between unchecked authority and a man who'd done nothing wrong. The witnesses were accumulating, the documentation was building, multiple angles, multiple devices, multiple perspectives, all capturing the same fundamental truth. And Officer Paulson, so focused on the man beside the Bentley, so certain of his own righteousness, so accustomed to stops like this going unchallenged, didn't notice or didn't care that his behavior was being preserved from a dozen different angles, that the traditional dynamic where his word against the driver's word would prevail was being disrupted by technology and solidarity and the simple act of people refusing to look away. Judge Carter made a decision. Officer Paulson, he said, reading the nameplate on the uniform, I'm going to tell you something important. I'm a federal appellate court judge. My identification is in my wallet, which you currently have. What you're doing right now is racial profiling and is being recorded by multiple cameras. Paulson actually laughed, a short, dismissive bark of sound that the body cam picked up perfectly. Federal judge. Right, that's what they all say. He looked down at the wallet still in his hand, the one Carter had given him with his license. He opened it more thoroughly now, pulling out cards and looking at each one with exaggerated skepticism. He found the judicial ID, the federal seal prominent, Carter's photograph, and credentials clearly printed. He stared at it for several seconds, his expression shifting from mockery to confusion to something approaching concern. But instead of backing down, Paulson doubled down. This could be fake. he said, holding the ID up as if examining it for forgery. "We've had people with fake credentials before. Stay right here while I verify this." Judge Carter's patience was thinning, but his composure remained intact. "Officer, you can verify my credentials through any federal database in about 30 seconds. My court identification number is on that card. You can call the courthouse. You can contact court security. What you cannot do is continue to detain me without cause." "I've got cause," Paulson snapped. "You're standing next to an expensive car you probably can't afford in a high crime area, acting suspicious." Every word was documented. Every word was wrong. The shopping center was in one of the safest neighborhoods in Atlanta. Carter hadn't done anything suspicious. He'd been loading shopping bags into his own car, and the assumption that he couldn't afford the vehicle was based on nothing but bias. The woman who'd started recording moved closer. "Excuse me, officer," she called out. "He hasn't done anything wrong. Why are you harassing him?" Paulson whipped around. "Ma'am, step back. This is police business." "This is a public garage," she replied, her phone steady, "and I have every right to record." Officer Paulson returned his attention to Judge Carter, frustration now clearly visible. "Put your hands behind your back." "On what charge?" Carter asked. "Obstruction," Paulson said. Carter's response was immediate and precise. "I am not obstructing. I am standing beside my vehicle, which I own, after lawfully loading shopping bags in a public garage. I have provided identification and registration. I have answered your questions. I have committed no crime, and I am not required to submit to arrest without probable cause." The legal precision of the response seemed to irritate Paulson more than silence would have. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, Unit 47. I need backup at Lenox Square parking garage, level P2. Uncooperative subject, possibly stolen vehicle." The false report would later become a key element of Carter's lawsuit. There was no stolen vehicle. The Bentley's registration was current, verified, with Carter's name clearly listed. The VIN matched. The insurance was valid. Every document was in order. But Paulson needed justification for the escalation, so he created one, broadcasting it over the radio where it would be recorded and timestamped and preserved. Judge Carter stood perfectly still, hands visible at his sides, watching as more shoppers stopped to observe. The crowd was growing. 5 people now, 7, 10, phones raised, recording from different angles, ensuring that no matter what happened next, the truth would be documented. Within 3 minutes, a second patrol car arrived, followed quickly by a third. Officers emerged, converging on the scene, and the underground garage that had been quiet moments before now felt like a major police operation. All for one man, standing calmly beside his own car with shopping bags in the trunk, guilty of nothing more than being black and owning an expensive vehicle. Officer Janet Torres, younger and less experienced than Paulson, approached first. "What's going on?" Paulson gestured at Carter. "Driver won't cooperate. Claims to be a federal judge. Vehicle might be stolen. Credentials look fake." Torres glanced at the Bentley, then at Carter standing calmly beside it, then at the growing crowd of witnesses. Her expression suggested uncertainty. "Sir," she addressed Carter, "can you provide identification?" "I already did," Carter replied calmly. "Officer Paulson has my license, registration, and judicial ID. All legitimate, all verifiable. I'm being detained without cause." Torres looked at Paulson. "Can I see the ID?" Paulson handed it over reluctantly. Torres examined it, pulled out her phone, and began typing. The federal court website, the roster of judges, the official listing with photographs and credentials. It took her less than 60 seconds to verify what Paulson had refused to accept. Her face went pale. "Derek," she said quietly, "this is real. He's actually a federal judge." The words carried through the garage. The witnesses heard. The woman recording zoomed in on Paulson's face as the realization hit him. The third officer, Sergeant Mike Holloway, stepped forward. He was older, early 50s, with the bearing of someone who'd seen too many situations go wrong. "What's the verification?" Torres turned her phone around, showing the official court website with Carter's photograph and biography, federal appellate court judge, appointed 6 years ago, currently sitting on the 11th Circuit. Holloway's jaw tightened. He looked at Paulson, then at the crowd, then at the multiple phones recording. He understood immediately that this wasn't just a bad stop. This was a catastrophe, fully documented, impossible to deny. "Your Honor," Holloway addressed Carter with the proper title, "I apologize for this encounter. You're free to go. We'll be reviewing this incident internally." Judge Carter didn't move toward his car door. Instead, he spoke clearly, ensuring the body cameras captured every word. "Sergeant, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was racial profiling. Officer Paulson stopped me because he assumed I couldn't legitimately own this vehicle. He fabricated a stolen vehicle report, he threatened arrest without cause, he violated multiple constitutional rights, and all of it is documented. Holloway nodded slowly. I understand, Your Honor. I strongly recommend you file a formal complaint. I will be doing more than that, Carter replied. Now, if you'll move your vehicles, I'm going home. The patrol cars backed away. The officers retreated, though Paulson's face had gone from red to ashen as the full weight of his mistakes settled over him. Judge Carter closed the trunk, walked around to the driver's side, and got into his Bentley. The engine purred to life, and he drove slowly toward the garage exit. Behind him, the witnesses remained, comparing videos, discussing what they'd seen, already uploading footage to social media. The woman who'd first started recording posted her video with a caption, "Federal judge racially profiled in Atlanta parking garage. Officer assumed he stole the car. Full video, no edits." Within an hour, it had 50,000 views. By morning, every major news outlet in Georgia was covering the story. Federal judge profiled while shopping. The headlines read, "Atlanta police officer accused of racial bias in documented encounter." Video shows judge questioned about vehicle ownership. The story had everything media organizations looked for. Clear video evidence, a sympathetic victim with unimpeachable credentials, an officer with a documented history, and the larger questions about systemic bias that resonated far beyond one parking garage. The footage went viral in waves. First, the woman's recording, raw and unedited, her voice audible as she called out the officer's behavior. Then the BodyCam video released after a public records request, which showed everything from Paulson's perspective and somehow made his actions look worse because it captured his own words, his own choices, with no filter or interpretation. News broadcasts played the footage in segments, pausing at key moments. Here, where Paulson refuses to verify credentials. Here, where he fabricates the stolen vehicle report. Here, where Torres confirms Carter is actually a judge and Paulson's face registers the realization. Legal analysts dissected each decision, explaining the constitutional violations in language accessible to viewers who might not understand probable cause or reasonable suspicion but understood unfairness when they saw it. Social media exploded with reactions. For Judge Carter, trended nationally within 36 hours. Legal professionals shared the videos with commentary about the Fourth Amendment violations. Civil rights advocates used it as an example of racial profiling that even skeptics couldn't dismiss because the victim's credentials were so clear. Community organizers pointed out that Carter's status shouldn't matter, that constitutional rights applied to everyone, but the case proved how bias operated even against people with significant social and professional standing. Civil rights organizations issued statements within 24 hours. The NAACP called for Paulson's termination. The ACLU announced they were monitoring the situation. Local activists organized protests outside the police precinct, demanding accountability for what they called a pattern of discriminatory enforcement that had gone unchecked for too long. Other victims began contacting attorneys, sharing their own experiences with Officer Paulson. A professor from Emory University described being stopped in the same parking garage, questioned about his Tesla, and told he should be driving something more appropriate for his income level. A surgeon recounted being detained for 45 minutes while Paulson ran his credentials multiple times, certain there must be outstanding warrants. A software engineer described being searched without consent after refusing to explain how he afforded his Range Rover. Each story followed the same pattern: expensive car, black driver, immediate suspicion, escalation without cause, and documentation that went nowhere because the department had chosen not to act on complaints against an officer who generated impressive stop statistics, even if those stops rarely resulted in actual enforcement. The Atlanta Police Department launched an internal investigation, but the public pressure made clear that internal review wouldn't be sufficient. The mayor called for an independent investigation. The city council demanded answers. Community leaders organized town halls where residents shared experiences of being profiled, creating a chorus of voices that could no longer be ignored. 10 days after the parking garage encounter, Judge William Carter filed a federal civil rights lawsuit. The complaint was 52 pages long, meticulously detailed, supported by multiple videos, body camera footage, witness statements, and Carter's own testimony. The named defendants included Officer Paulson, Sergeant Holloway for failing to properly supervise, the precinct commander for ignoring complaint patterns, and the city itself for maintaining policies that allowed discriminatory policing to continue. The claims included unlawful detention, racial profiling, violation of Fourth Amendment rights, violation of 14th Amendment rights, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and civil conspiracy to deprive constitutional rights. The damages sought totaled $14.2 million. But the lawsuit was about more than money. Discovery requests demanded 5 years of Paulson's stop records, personnel files for all officers in the precinct, complaint records, training materials, and internal communications about racial bias. The case was building towards something larger, an examination of whether the department had created a culture that encouraged, or at least tolerated, discriminatory enforcement. The data that emerged during discovery was damning. Paulson had stopped black drivers at rates 380% higher than white drivers in the same patrol area. His vehicle searches of black drivers were 520% higher. His use of backup for routine stops involving black motorists was 290% higher. And his citation rate was 73% lower than department average, suggesting most stops had no legitimate law enforcement purpose. More troubling was what the internal communications revealed. Supervisors had been aware of Paulson's disproportionate stop patterns for years. Early intervention systems had flagged him repeatedly. Complaints had piled up, but each time, his sergeant had defended him, claiming he was just proactive, just thorough, just trying to keep the community safe. The protective instinct within the department had shielded Paulson from consequences, even as evidence mounted that his policing was driven by bias rather than law. The pattern wasn't just about numbers. It was about people whose daily lives had been interrupted by bias wearing a badge. It was about professionals who'd achieved success being treated like criminals because their success didn't match the officers' expectations. It was about dignity, stripped away in parking garages, on street corners, in front of shopping centers, documented only by victims' memories and occasionally by phone cameras that caught fragments of longer encounters. One victim, a high school principal, described being stopped in front of his own school while arriving for work. Students watched as Paulson questioned him about his Audi, demanded to search it, and threatened arrest when the principal asked for a supervisor. The humiliation lasted 20 minutes, ending only when the school resource officer recognized the principal and intervened. That incident had been reported to the department. The complaint had been marked as resolved with verbal counseling. No record existed of that counseling ever occurring. The city's attorneys reviewed the evidence and came to a stark conclusion. The videos were indefensible. The BodyCam footage showed clear racial profiling. The false stolen vehicle report was documented on radio recordings. Judge Carter's credibility was unimpeachable. Fighting this case at trial would be disastrous, both legally and politically. A federal judge testifying about being profiled by city police would generate national headlines and set precedents the city didn't want established. 4 months after the parking garage encounter, settlement negotiations began. Carter's attorneys demanded not just compensation, but structural reforms. The city needed to admit wrongdoing. Paulson needed to be terminated. Training needed to be overhauled. Oversight mechanisms needed to be strengthened. The settlement couldn't just resolve one case. It needed to address systemic problems. The final settlement, reached after 6 weeks of negotiation, was comprehensive. $14.2 million paid to Judge Carter. A formal public apology from the mayor and police chief. Officer Paulson terminated with certification revoked, ensuring he could never work in law enforcement again. Sergeant Holloway demoted and reassigned to a position without supervisory authority for failing to properly manage his officers. But the most significant provisions were the reforms. The department would implement mandatory implicit bias training for all officers 60 hours within the first year. Stop data would be analyzed quarterly for evidence of racial disparities, with results published publicly. An independent monitor would audit the department for 3 years. Community oversight boards would review all complaints involving allegations of discrimination. Body camera footage of every stop would be randomly audited monthly. Officers showing problematic patterns would be immediately placed under enhanced supervision. The reforms extended to hiring and promotion. The department would recruit more officers from diverse backgrounds. Promotion criteria would include evaluations of bias awareness and community trust. Performance reviews would consider not just stop numbers, but the legitimacy and outcomes of those stops. The emphasis would shift from volume to quality, from activity to actual public safety. Training academies redesigned their curricula. The Carter case became required study, along with dozens of others. Recruits watched the parking garage footage and were asked to identify every decision point where the encounter could have gone differently. They role-played scenarios where they had to intervene when a colleague exhibited bias. They heard from community members about the impact of being profiled, the fear it created, the trust it destroyed. The garage itself became an unlikely teaching tool. Lenox Square management installed a memorial plaque near where the encounter occurred, with text reading, "On this site, an unjust stop led to meaningful change. May we learn from this moment to build a more equitable community." Tour groups from the academy visited, standing in the spot where Judge Carter had been detained, discussing what the case meant for their approach to policing. Some officers resisted the changes. A vocal minority claimed the reforms would prevent them from doing their jobs effectively. Several retired or transferred to other departments rather than adapt. But most recognized that the Carter case had exposed problems they'd known existed but felt powerless to address. The reforms gave them language and tools to challenge bias when they saw it, permission to prioritize quality over quantity, and protection from retaliation when they spoke up about problematic behavior. The department's stop data showed dramatic shifts within the first year. Racial disparities in stops decreased by 47%. Searches without probable cause dropped by 61%. Complaints about officer bias fell by 58%. Use of force incidents declined by 34%. The changes weren't perfect and problems persisted, but the trajectory was clear. Accountability created pressure for better behavior. Community trust began to rebuild slowly. Officers attended neighborhood meetings, not to defend the department, but to listen. Youth programs connected police with young people in contexts beyond enforcement. Community policing initiatives emphasized relationships over arrests. The work was slow, often frustrating, but necessary. Judge Carter returned to his routine, presiding over cases with the same careful attention he'd always brought to the bench. He gave no interviews. He didn't write an opinion piece. He released a single statement when the settlement was finalized. This case was never about my position as a judge. It was about my rights as a citizen. Every person, regardless of race or status, deserves to be treated with dignity and within the bounds of constitutional law. Officer Paulson's actions weren't an isolated mistake. They were part of a pattern the department had tolerated for too long. I hope this settlement creates lasting change, not just policies on paper, but actual transformation in how officers see and serve their communities. The statement was measured, precise. The voice of someone who understood that legal victories didn't automatically translate to cultural change, that settlements could mandate reform, but implementation required sustained effort and genuine commitment. Months after the settlement, Judge Carter returned to Lenox Square to shop for another family occasion. He parked in the same garage, on the same level, not far from where the encounter had occurred. He walked past the memorial plaque, pausing to read the words he'd seen before, but which carried different weight now. A patrol car was visible 3 rows away, officer inside completing paperwork. The officer looked up as Carter began loading shopping bags into his trunk, made eye contact, and nodded respectfully. No approach, no questions, no assumption that someone needed to explain their presence. Just 2 people sharing space in a parking garage, one shopping, one working, neither seeing the other as a problem requiring intervention. Carter closed his trunk, got into his Bentley, and drove toward the exit, thinking about how much had changed because one officer had acted on bias, one judge had refused to accept being treated as less than equal, and multiple cameras had documented everything so thoroughly that denial became impossible. The cameras in that garage still record constantly high-definition footage backed up to secure servers. The memory remains preserved in video files and court records, and training materials and conversations that happen when officers gather to discuss what they've learned from the Carter case. And every officer who patrols Atlanta's affluent neighborhoods knows the story of what happened when assumptions about who belongs where met a federal judge who understood exactly what his rights were and had the resources to fight for them effectively, creating change that extended far beyond one parking garage, one settlement, one case. Because sometimes the most important courtroom isn't made of marble and mahogany. Sometimes it's concrete and fluorescent lights, security cameras, and cell phone videos. A space where justice happened not because of the system, but in spite of it. Where documentation defeated denial, where witnesses refused to look away, where one person's refusal to accept being treated as less than human sparked reforms that would protect thousands of others who would never know his name but would benefit from his courage. If you believe that profiling should always be challenged, that documentation saves lives, that accountability isn't optional, and that change happens when people refuse to accept being treated as less than human, then hit that subscribe button. These stories matter, these lessons resonate, and these fights continue, requiring vigilance, courage, and the determination to build systems that serve everyone equally Regardless of what they look like or what they drive or whether they match someone's assumptions about who belongs in an expensive car,